Good afternoon, good evening, everybody, or good morning to those joining us from Europe as well. Welcome to this latest webinar from the EU-ABC, where we're taking a look at ASEAN's green recovery. We are very honoured to have with us at the beginning of this webinar His Excellency Mr. Don Pramudwinai, who is the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs for Thailand. And also with us today is our moderator, Chen Chen Lee, who is a Senior Fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, and I will hand the reins to Chen Chen just shortly, but I will, if our panel and our guest of honour do not mind, I will quickly take a screenshot of all of us, so we have it for our memories. 1 second. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand the reins back to Chen Chen to introduce the DPM and then carry on the discussion from there. So Chen Chen, over to you, and you're muted, by the way.
Thank you, Chris, and a good evening to everyone who's listening in from wherever you are. I understand we have an extremely diverse audience and participants from all over the world today, friends and colleagues not just from the Asia-Pacific region, but from North America, Europe, and the Middle East. I'm myself based in Melbourne, Australia, hence my virtual background. As Chris said, we have an excellent lineup of speakers for this webinar, and I will introduce each of them before their short presentation. We will have plenty of time for an interactive Q&A after the presentations. But first, I would like to invite His Excellency, Mr. Don Pramudwinai, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs from Thailand, to deliver the keynote address. Before you deliver, Your Excellency, I would just like to share with the audience a short bio of yourself. His Excellency Mr. Don Pramudwinai had a long, distinguished diplomatic career, having served as the Thai ambassador to Switzerland, China, the EU, the UN in New York, and the US. In 2014, Mr. Don was appointed Deputy Foreign Minister and was elevated to Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2015. Last month, Mr. Don was also appointed Deputy Prime Minister in addition to his position as the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Since 2016, Thailand has been the ASEAN Coordinator on Sustainable Development Cooperation. Last year, Thailand was the ASEAN Chair and was instrumental in several initiatives related to SDGs, such as the Bangkok Declaration on Combating Marine Debris in ASEAN region, the ASEAN Network for Combating Illegal, Unreported, and Unregulated Fishing, and advocating ASEAN's position at the UN Climate Action Summit 2019 in New York. Under Thailand's chairmanship last year, ASEAN also established 7 ASEAN centers in Thailand, including the ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue. And with that, I would like to hand over the floor to Your Excellency, Deputy Prime Minister Don Pramudwinai. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Good day to you all, wherever you are. But here in Thailand, we'd like to extend to you our greetings, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the World Economic Forum and the EU-ASEAN Business Council for inviting me to give these opening remarks for the session on financing ASEAN green recovery and the SDGs. The year 2020 is a year of global crisis, with the casualties and economic damages thus far often compared to those caused by a world war. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted global economic and trade activities, as well as the supply chain, international travel, and tourism. Millions have lost their livelihood, not to mention lives. On the health crisis, Thailand has been fortunate, thanks to its strong public cooperation and the dedication of the head of the government, who has seized the issue from day one of its outbreak in Thailand and closely monitored its development on a daily basis, with assistance of our medical professionals and a strong million village health volunteers. These volunteers have been internationally recognized as a crucial and integral part of our success story in containing the spread of the disease in our nation. On the economic front, the IMF forecasts that ASEAN GDP will contract 2.7% this year, the worst since the Asian financial crisis of 1997. And according to the World Bank, an additional 11 million people in the East Asia and Pacific region will fall into poverty. The global scale of public, economic, and social disruption is unprecedented in living memory. But therein lies the opportunity for us to rethink and reset our development goals and strategies, as well as to build our resilience to withstand future shocks and make our recovery and growth sustainable. ASEAN recognizes this and is making accelerated efforts towards achieving green recovery and the SDGs. In fact, ASEAN is doing so together with external partners and a wide range of stakeholders through advancing multiple policy-oriented initiatives, innovative mechanisms, and green projects that are feasible, as well as environmentally and financially rewarding. And since 2017, ASEAN has made efforts to promote synergies between its community building efforts and its SDGs. This is known as the Complementarities Initiative. ASEAN has also developed new mechanisms, such as the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, to respond to the socio-economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this framework will be submitted to the ASEAN leaders at its next ASEAN Summit in November. Moving forward, I see at least 3 areas where ASEAN can work more closely with our partners and stakeholders to promote green recovery and achieve the SDGs. These efforts will also be in partnership with the private sector. First, ASEAN can work together towards building long-term resilience and sustainability by putting priority on green and renewable energy and promoting our BCG economy. BCG, as you all know, is a bio-circular and green economy. Here in Thailand, it's known as a regional hub for automobile production, and we are working on developing electronic vehicles. We could also collaborate on creating an ecosystem for other green businesses. And this could mean designing green financing schemes, such as the low-interest loans for green enterprise or investing in ASEAN green bonds. In Thailand, a number of private companies have issued green bonds. And last month, the Thai government offered up to $1 billion in 15 years green bonds to investors to help finance coronavirus-related measures, as well as mass transit projects. Second, ASEAN can take a whole of community approach. For example, through the exchange of best practices between governments and businesses via the promotion of capacity building and by making financial and in-kind contributions to ASEAN centers such as ASEAN Center for Energy in Indonesia and the ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue in Thailand. We can also encourage the exchange of homegrown development philosophies and approaches to promoting sustainable development. Thailand's management of the COVID-19 pandemic is an example of our homegrown approach for sustainable recovery. The sufficiency economy philosophy, or SEP, could be an alternative model for growth as it prioritizes moderation and social resilience. Now, on the third point, we can work together on green connectivity through, for instance, the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, which was set up to provide financial support for green infrastructure investments. We appreciate our external partners and financial institutions, such as the European Union, the Republic of Korea, the Asian Development Bank, and the European Investment Bank for their generous contribution to the facility itself. We could work on capturing the opportunities presented to us by digital technology for businesses. Here, ASEAN is working to equip MSMEs with much needed green finance to promote digital literacy skills to ensure quality jobs and reskill our workforce for the future. After all, MSMEs account for over 95% of total businesses in ASEAN and employ over half of the ASEAN workforce. Ladies and gentlemen, panelists, I believe that the three areas just outlined can help our collective efforts to overcome this pandemic and bounce back, not as a dead cat bounces, but towards a more solid and stronger recovery and sustainability. Lastly, I wish to leave with you some questions for additional discussions on issues that could be useful for furtherance of public-private partnership. 1. How can we build a truly sustainable society, one that values social responsibility and inclusiveness, including for senior citizens in an aging society? 2. How can we, the whole of community approach, help to promote family and youth welfare, an issue which traditionally is the responsibility of the state? Indeed, in the spirit of SDGs, we must seek to leave no one behind. I would like to once again thank the WEF and the EU-ASEAN Business Council for organizing this event. I certainly wish all participants a most productive discussion and the greatest success of the Sustainable Development Impact Summit. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for a very succinct as well as a very informative presentation. I believe Your Excellency will take your leave right now. Thank you so much for generously sharing your time with us.
Thank you. Have a good day. Thanks.
Have a good evening, sir. Well, His Excellency has presented us with a few questions, which I hope we will address later on during this webinar. For those of you who have just joined us, my name is Chen Chen, and I'm the Senior Fellow with the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. And we have just heard from His Excellency, Deputy Prime Minister Don Pramudwinai from Thailand, who has given us a very broad framework of where ASEAN is when it comes to the SDGs and green recovery in the pandemic environment. Now with that, I'd like to move to our next speaker, Mr. Warren Patterson, Head of Commodity Strategy, ING Singapore. Now Warren has worked in the commodities industry for over a decade, and at ING has been actively involved in looking at energy transition. Warren is also one of the authors of a recent report that concludes that Asian governments have missed the opportunity for a green recovery in their fiscal stimulus packages. So Warren, please, with your presentation, outline to us the Asia-Pacific region and environmental response to the COVID-19 crisis. What are the climate targets that have been reached and missed? The floor is yours, please.
Thanks, Chen Chen. Good afternoon, all. So obviously, COVID-19 has had a serious impact on the global economy, with no economy around the world left untouched. And as we previously heard, it had a setting back in achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals, with the goals of poverty, equality, zero hunger, quality education, and health among some of those which are suffering as a result of COVID-19. However, with lockdowns and travel restrictions across the globe, the one silver lining is that we are set to see global carbon emissions fall drastically this year. According to the IEA, we could see emissions fall by around 8% year on year, which would be the largest annual decline on record and take carbon emissions to the lowest levels since 2010. But the issue is, without action, this will be a one-off event. As economies start to return to normal, and when we start traveling again, emissions will clearly start to trend higher once again. If we just look at China as an example, during the peak lockdown, emissions were down 25% year on year. However, post-lockdown, we have seen emissions surge once again. According to Carbon Brief, China's emissions in May increased by around 45% year on year as industries returned. And it's really thought that this has continued in the months that have followed. I guess when you see China producing record amounts of steel every month to meet demand for infrastructure projects, it's no surprise to see the bounce higher in carbon emissions once again. Therefore, as countries in Asia and around the world have started to release stimulus programs, there has been a lot of emphasis on how much of this stimulus is green. Further green initiatives now would go a long way in helping the region in meeting targets under the Paris Agreement. Under current policy, it does seem as though most countries in the region will fall short of their nationally determined contributions for the Paris Agreement. But let's be optimistic and assume that these countries were to hit their NDCs by 2030. There's still the big question over whether these NDCs are ambitious enough. Many would say no, and one of the key reasons for this is that if we look at Asia, the bulk of countries have committed to reducing carbon intensity or reducing emissions from a business as usual projection. In fact, there are very few countries in Asia which are committed to reducing total emissions. There's no doubt that APAC is obviously a key global emitter, and so the need for action from the region is crucial. The region makes up around 47% of total global emissions, with China obviously key, with it making up around 58% of APAC emissions. Meanwhile, emissions from the region over the last 20 years has grown by 125%. If we compare that to the US and the EU, over the same period, emissions have declined by 10% and 18% respectively. So what we did at ING recently is we went through all the economies in APAC that we cover, looked at their total COVID-19 stimulus packages so far, and how much of that is set to go towards green initiatives. And really, I have to say, we were pretty disappointed with the lack of emphasis on the environment. We were pretty lenient in defining what was green stimulus, and still there were a number of countries in the region who allocated none of the stimulus or close to zero of it towards green projects. Within APAC and from the economies we look at, New Zealand was the standout with about 13% of its COVID-19 stimulus classed as green. And then if we look at ASEAN, Singapore is the only standout there with almost 11% of stimulus going towards green initiatives. So these two are really the standouts across APAC, but even with them, there is some distance away from what we are seeing in other regions. For example, in the EU, about 30% of spending is set to be green. And in fact, under the new multi-annual budget and recovery plan, spending on green projects is about 3 times higher than what it was under the previous multi-annual budget. I think this really highlights the different priorities and approaches that we are seeing across regions. Now, what would be great for ASEAN and APAC is if more focus is put on the environment with any further stimulus packages. And I think on top of that, while countries in the region are committed to their 2030 Paris Agreement goals, it would be ideal if countries set an interim target and then gear projects in order to meet those targets. The reason I think this is a good idea is because if these countries have shorter term targets, they may feel more urgency to act on those. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Warren. And I'm sure we'll come back to you later with more questions about what you've raised. Some very pertinent points raised there. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Our next speaker is Dr. Chatib Basri, former Minister of Finance from the Republic of Indonesia and Chairman of the PT Bank Mandiri, as well as Chairman of the PT XL Axiata. But Chatib previously was also the Chairman of the Indonesian Investment Coordinating Board. His expertise is international trade, macroeconomics, and political economy. But Chatib, I'd like to invite you to speak, please.
Thank you very much, Chen. A very good afternoon to all of you. It is a great pleasure to be here. In this particular occasion, I would like to share my view more on the economic policy perspective. As Deputy Prime Minister mentioned in his remarks about the impact of this COVID-19. And then the way I look at the government in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, to respond to this situation is we have to, like it or not, to rely much on the fiscal policy, because the biggest problem at this moment in many countries is about the issue how to get the pandemic under control. That should be the top priority. So in order to address this issue, the government in any country in Southeast Asia, in Asia, usually will focus on the three things. The first one is to allocate funding for health. This is for the test kits, the paramedics, the medicine, etc. Yeah. The second one is the government also need to focus on the issue of social protection, providing the social protection by providing, for example, like the cash transfer, the social assistance support, the food staple, etc. Yeah. The other typical type of policy is to support the business, especially the small and medium enterprise. And this is very interesting that three types of policy are basically relatively the same all across Asia and also Asia Pacific. I would mention that if you look at Australia, for example, they also have launched a very similar policy. If you look at Singapore, yeah, Indonesia, and many Southeast Asian countries, that will be the short-term policy. But exactly like Warren mentioned in his remarks, the issue is perhaps in the short term, many Southeast Asian governments are not focusing on this fiscal stimulus package which is friendly to the environment. Yeah, and maybe we can learn the experience of the 2008 crisis, yeah, during the global financial crisis, because the fiscal stimulus at that time, it varies among countries. But if we learn from our experience in 2008, a country like China, they were not really focusing on this environmental friendly fiscal stimulus at that time. But if you look at Korea, I think they did quite relatively well, by launching the fiscal stimulus which is environmental friendly. So they focus on the investment, but mostly on this clean energy, on infrastructure, sustainability of the transportation, the nature of conservation. So if we learn from our experience from 2008, that Korean model perhaps something that will be very interesting. Then I'll discuss later on about, because somehow we need to get a political support. Yeah. But all of these things that I mentioned, to get a support, to get the pandemic under control, to provide a social protection, to support business, and then for the medium term, you invest on the investment, environmental friendly, infrastructure, clean energy. This will require funding. This will require financing. But the problem is, many Southeast Asian countries, of course, if you're talking about Singapore, Singapore is an outlier for this. They do have the capacity for running a budget deficit 10% without any difficulties because they have resources. Yeah, but you can see countries like Indonesia, like Laos, like Cambodia, Myanmar. Yeah, somehow if we want to increase the budget deficit, there will be a limitation of our room to increase the budget deficit because it will require funding. Yeah, and if you look at the composition, let me lay out some possibilities, the source of financing. We can go for a domestic pool of fund, but unfortunately in some ASEAN countries, in Asian countries as well, the pool of domestic fund is limited. So it's not enough to, to dig the fund from domestic. If you go to the global bond, yeah, in the beginning was okay, but if you look at the current situation with the high yield now, because there's a lot of uncertainty, especially in the last 3 days, we saw that the stock market drops, the bond market drops, and a lot of uncertainty. In the case of Asian countries, the Chiang Mai initiative is there, but unfortunately this is untested. Yeah, because we don't really have an experience for this. And unfortunately, for many Asian countries, would be difficult to go for the IMF because the stigma of the 1998. So Southeast Asian economies somehow are trapped on how to find the financings. So on my remarks, let me propose on one thing, that maybe Southeast Asian countries can explore this possibility. The collapse in oil price represents a unique opportunity to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies once and for all, because the oil price is relatively low. And I'll call this policy, this is a triple win, because it will be good to reduce the demand for the fossil fuel, and then we can redirect this money for help for the poor people, to help the fiscal stimulus during the pandemic. And the third one, this is also good for the macro. Yeah, and why the fuel subsidy? Because the problem is that fuel subsidy encourages overuse of fuel, which has horrendous environmental implication. So rather than subsidizing fuel, we should tax the address of these externalities. So one recent study estimates that eliminating oil and gas subsidies alone could have reduced global carbon emission by 5 to 6% in 2015 and by 28% if coal subsidies had also been eliminated. So fuel subsidies are also innovation in the way that I mentioned, it is biased in favor to the middle and upper income group, because it is the rich who consume fuel more, yeah, while poor and lower middle income class, they don't really get a benefit of the fuel subsidy. And then if you look at data, yeah, according to 2015 review by the IMF, the richest 20%, yeah, enjoy this fuel subsidy, yeah, compared to the poorest 20%. And in a country like Indonesia, we spend about 3.1% of GDP on fuel subsidies in 2018, but only 1.4% of GDP on health. So you can see, you know, the comparison. When I was a finance minister, I did adjust the fuel price by 44% at that time. The inflation went up, and you know, a lot of demonstration on the street. But nowadays, I can see the opportunity. Why? Because the oil price is relatively low. So it will be relatively easy politically for the government to remove the fuel subsidy and make the, you know, put the automatic adjustment of the market without really triggering a sort of like protest from the people. And then if the government would like to maintain the same fuel price, they can do this. They can impose the surcharge and use this money to finance the fiscal stimulus for health, for social protection, and to support the small, medium enterprise. So basically, in sum up, I could see, you know, maybe we can try to make this fiscal stimulus is more environmental friendly, and I can see the room and opportunity to finance that by removing the fuel subsidy and allocating the funding for health, for financing the fiscal stimulus during the pandemic. I leave it up here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Chatib. Just a very quick question. You yourself said that the removal of the fuel subsidy has been politically very unpopular in Indonesia. Is this measure being considered right now by the Indonesian government when it comes to as a medium to long-term solution? Just a quick response, please.
Not at this moment, but I can see the room because the oil price is relatively low. Would be, you know, less political resistance at this moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pak. And with that, I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Mr. Willard McLean, Vice Chair of the Global Financial Institutions and Vice Chairman of the Asia Technology Group from Citi. Will covers large financial institution and technology clients primarily in Asia, as well as lead the Asia Pacific Financial Institutions corporate investment banking business. He also oversees the investment banking activities in a number of sectors, including oil and gas, metals and mining, power, healthcare, and real estate. From 2012 to 2016, Will was the corporate and investment banking head of the ASEAN region for Citi. I think it's a very nice segue from Pak Chatib to Will, since you represent the private sector and a very large banking MNC here. And And I think what we'd like to hear from you would be the role of the private sector in financing some of these, the green recovery, as well as a more sustainable development. And what would be some of the initiatives or ideas that you can suggest? The floor is yours, please, Will.
Thank you, Chin Chen, and hello, everyone. So I think just a couple sort of initial comments. Obviously, others have commented on the economic challenges ASEAN faces during this global pandemic. And I guess I'd start with the bad news, which is I think whatever we think those challenges are today, they're probably going to grow in a few respects. I think we've yet to see all the collateral damage of this crisis. As Pak Chadha was relaying, there have been a number of relief measures that have been put in place in different countries to try to minimize the impact, but a lot of those relief measures will expire in the coming months, and that could result in increased poverty and bankruptcies and other challenges, consumer stress that we haven't yet seen. I think the second thing, which is a good and bad thing, is there are a lot of long-lasting potential societal impacts to this crisis. Consumer behaviors have changed, supply chains have been disrupted, the world has been deglobalizing, both because of the pandemic and because of politics. Some of that is actually good from a green perspective, as Warren mentioned, but it's also very detrimental from an economic perspective and creates economic displacements. And finally, all of those things that put tremendous fiscal pressure on governments, as Pak Chadha has mentioned. So I agree, a lot of the challenge here is how do you finance this recovery? And I think that the two key focal areas in my mind for reinitiating the long-term recovery and the engine of growth and sustainability. One is around infrastructure and creating a new wave of infrastructure investment in the region, which is really focused and reinforced by the key SDGs, whether social or environmental. And obviously, infrastructure investment is an old tool that's oftentimes been used in Asia to generate growth. So how do we finance it this time when so many countries are fiscally strained, and also how do we make it environmentally more friendly? I think the key to the funding is really around in what I would call investment recycling. By that I mean taking existing stabilized cash flow generating projects, many of which are currently owned by governments or state-owned enterprises or government partnerships, using those to raise new funds, whether that is through, and oftentimes through the capital markets. It could be done in a securitization, it could be done in a trust company structure or other things. And then using that money that's raised to invest in new sustainable projects. This isn't wholly new. Investment recycling has been around for a long time, but it hasn't actually been done in very large size in ASEAN so far. And it hasn't been done in a way with a governance around gradually phasing out old non-environmentally friendly projects and investing in green projects or socially inclusive projects. The second key focus area beyond infrastructure, I think, is technology. Technology, we all know, is changing our world very rapidly. And I think one way it's been changing things is that really in the ability to deliver inclusive services, particularly in areas like education, health, and financial services. Cloud-based technologies allow us to deliver those services in very high quality to any person from whatever background. And I think that the opportunity to expand those services in ASEAN can create, in partnership between governments and private sector, can really create a new economic energy at the micro level by enabling small businesses and individuals to grow, become better educated, and live healthier lives.
Thank you very much, Will, for sharing some ideas on how the recovery can be financed. And I'm sure we can discuss more about the infrastructure and the technology areas, both of which are extremely important. And I would say, particularly in digital economy of ASEAN, a very much a growing sector in the region. Now, for our last and final speaker would be Mr. Donald Kanat, Chairman of East Spring Investments, which is the Asia Investment Organization of Prudential. Don is also the chairman of Prudence Foundation, the community engagement arm of Prudential in Asia. At the same time, Don serves as the chairman of the EU-ASEAN Business Council. In 2011 to 12, Don chaired the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Insurance and Asset Manager. He's co-chair of the steering committee of the ASEAN Hub of the Sustainable Development Investment Partnership of the World Economic Forum. The Sustainable Development Investment Partnership is actually one of the co-organizers of today's webinar. So Don, as the chair of the EU-ASEAN Business Council, you have been working with ASEAN and other countries' business councils to urge the ASEAN leaders to take special steps to accelerate a resilient recovery. In your presentation, could you share with us why this is important and what are some of the key areas that ASEAN needs to address? The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Chen Chen, and thank you, fellow panelists. It's a great start to this meeting. You asked why is it important? I think from the first remarks of the Deputy Prime Minister and from the other panelists, we can see we're talking about not just green, but the financing of SDGs. And if we look at the SDGs broadly, I think we can all agree that there are multiple needs that transcend what we would think of as green. And Will touched on some of these a minute ago, but we're talking about needs that depend very much on economic opportunity, jobs, health, education, gender equality, opportunities which arise from the economy expanding. The current crisis, as we know from the earlier remarks, and I guess from everyone who's watching this in some form, many from their homes because they're not able to get to work, the current crisis is not only affecting the achievement of what we now are targeting in the SDGs, but we're actually backsliding in some important ways on achievements that have already been made. If we look, I could switch to a next chart here. We look at just a few examples of that. When we have 50% of enrolled learners affected by school closures, and we know that not every student has equal access to digital learning, that's obviously a huge challenge. Also, we know that women are disproportionately impacted by the lockdowns related to COVID and in the damages to certain industries. We know women are 70% of the healthcare workforce. We know that they have a high percentage of the workers in the most affected industries like tourism and hospitality. And oftentimes there's data that shows that women are disproportionately affected by the layoffs in other industries that are hit, like retail, for example. So these are obviously not helping, and actually we're backsliding in important ways on achievements that have already been made. And some of the most important areas where we're backsliding are related to health. There's some information out there that you can find that suggests that vaccination levels have fallen to levels they were 25 years ago. So great progress that had been made seems to be backsliding. And of course, poverty, we know millions of people are now slipping back into poverty because of the impact. So the overall SDGs, we have to recognize, are threatened at this point fundamentally by economic stress. And so when we talk about a sustainable recovery, we have to keep our minds on both of those words, sustainable and recovery. And we need to be focusing right now very much on recovery as well. And that's when you ask about what's the EU-ASEAN Business Council been doing? Well, it's not just the EU-ABC, but other business councils in the region, the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, ASEAN BAC, almost every other business council that we can imagine is joined together to make a suggestion, a recommendation to the ASEAN leaders, which is captured in a very specific document called a Pathways document. And that is to ask the leaders to use this crisis as an opportunity to accelerate If we switch to another slide, now we just go ahead here, we can keep this going, thank you. Look at the priorities that ASEAN has already set for itself to break down some barriers that exist, not between ASEAN and other regions like Europe or North America or China, but within ASEAN, barriers that prohibit mobility of people or restrict investment or trade that ASEAN itself has said it wants to address, but so far has not addressed. And so the business community has offered up some specific suggestions to try to create a sense of urgency and to use this opportunity when everyone agrees on the importance of these changes to actually create some institutional momentum to make those changes. Part of that is building back better. That's a phrase that probably is getting used almost everywhere these days. And I think our other speakers have touched on this. And the way I would put it is that we need to have some sort of green or sustainable filter, a set of principles for reviewing these pandemic emergency measures. Warren mentioned that Europe is spending a higher percentage of its special fiscal measures on things that you would consider sustainable or green. I don't know whether ASEAN, it doesn't appear from the statistics that Warren's report cites or the examples that Pak Khatib gave, that ASEAN has yet challenged itself with some sort of green filter to say, let's take a look at what we're currently spending money on, like fossil fuel subsidies, or propose new ideas and overlay that. Is this positioning us for the economy of the future? Is it creating the jobs of the future? Or are we using this money to reinforce the past? The first rule of getting out of a hole is to stop digging. So I think this is a very important question that the leaders need to ask themselves, are we putting the necessary filters on these proposals as they're coming up? And if they need to be adjusted, let's adjust them before we spend the money. The last thing I would target, it would be sort of what I'll call the biggest green issues. They don't necessarily fall under business as usual, or even the fiscal issues we would talk about in terms of the current recovery. But very, very critical issues that stand in front of us that we need to address, for example, decarbonizing energy. This is an area where I think there's enormous opportunity, particularly if we go back to what Will said a minute ago about recycling of existing energy projects. We have many examples of existing coal-fired electricity projects in Indonesia, in Vietnam, and basically most of the countries in the region, certainly in China and India, all over Asia. These are producing infrastructure, making electricity today. Can we use this principle of very, very liquid, low-cost financing to provide a way for countries to recycle, take those entities, these coal-fired electricity, and put them into a special structure and over a shorter period of time than otherwise, retire them and transition to a more sustainable energy mix. So I'll stop there. If there's time later to talk more about that kind of idea, I'd like to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. I do have a few follow-up questions, but before that, I'd like to encourage the participants, the audience, to submit your questions. You can do that via I believe, the Q&A channel at the bottom of your screen. I've seen one question already. Please keep your questions coming. What I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to go around the panelists with some follow-up questions. And after that, we'll open up to a more interactive Q&A session with the audience. But just let me stay on you, Don, for just a little while. You spoke about the decarbonizing of energy, which is a very critical part of green recovery. Now, as you know, the region is still very much heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So what are some of the examples where ASEAN might scale up financing on renewable projects, renewable energy projects, and accelerate progress on climate change?
Well, thank you very much. This gives me a chance to continue what I was starting to talk about a minute ago. And building on this point around using this massive amount of global liquidity at very low interest rates, the question is, how might we put that to work? So let's just start with kind of just making sure everybody understands how important this is. We can look at lots of available data that shows what are the current sources of emissions and what is the trajectory that the world needs to pursue to get to a level that to avoid dangerous climate change. And you can see from this chart that the biggest part of the emission profile is coming from energy production, okay, from power and energy, okay? So we have to deal with decarbonizing the power sector. So if we said, of that, where is the leverage in that power sector in terms of emissions, we can see, if we actually click, we can see that 2/3 of that is related to coal, okay? And so there is the heart of the heart, okay? What could we do about coal? And how critical is it to deal with that? Let me just give you one other chart here for a second. What this chart shows is total global emissions of about 55 gigatons a year of carbon equivalents. 10 gigatons is just the existing coal-fired electrical facilities in the world. A lot of those are in Asia. How big is 10 gigatons? Well, by 2050, the world in total, from all sources, not just electricity, but all of these sources here, transportation, land use, everything else, has to get down to 8.4 if we believe the most liberal scenario of the 1.5 degree target. So just the existing coal-fired plants alone, if they're not retired and transitioned to some other less emitting form of energy, will overwhelm the total global emissions. So we have to deal with this. If we don't deal with it in the next 20 years, we're going to have a serious failure to hit the global climate targets. There's no way to hit them. It's just mathematically 10's bigger than 8.4. So the question is, how could we, in the current COVID situation, make progress on this? Well, go back to what Will said earlier. What if we could find a way, if we flip to the next page, of taking existing, assembling money from today's investors? Some countries today can borrow at negative interest rates, and create a mechanism. If we click a few more clicks here, just go through right to the end of the chart, please. To create a mechanism that could go to the owners, maybe state-owned industries, maybe in some countries it's a mix of private and state-owned industries, and figure out a way to create a securitization, a refinancing of those plants, put them in a sequester facility with a specific time to retire. That would put billions of dollars of new finance into the hands of the owners of these facilities, let's say state-owned industries or state-owned grids, who could upgrade their grids, who could invest and accelerate in building more renewables, okay? The current plants would run for a limited lifetime until paying back the investors and until the alternative energy was available. Part of this extra finance created, the billions of dollars that could be created through this mechanism, could be used to provide transition for economies that are going to be affected. There are people working in the current industry, so it would take time, years for those people to be retrained, for new industries to be created. But without the financing to do that, that's very hard to imagine. So by recycling the assets and paying for them, if you will, a fair price, countries would generate finance, be able to retire those assets over a period agreed, 10 years, 12 years, instead of the 30 or 40 years they're going to run if they're not retired. So that's just one example of a way. There are other people in the world today. There's some great work that's being done by climate economists and scientists, the Rocky Mountain Institute and other climate groups on methods for financing the retirement of coal. But this is just one idea that takes that securitization principle and could use recycling of assets to create more money for renewables.
Thank you, Don. And on this, maybe I could just get Will and Pak Chatip to jump in as well. If there is a clear pathway, in terms of generating new financing for these projects, so why aren't ASEAN governments doing more of this? Will and Pak Chatip, please share your views.
You want me to start first?
Sure.
Sure. Yes,
Dr.
please.
Please.
Chen, I think this is a very good question, and I think all of us already know what are the answers. Yeah. Let me quote what Jean-Claude Juncker said. We all know what to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. So the issue is more on the political economy. Yeah. If we want to make sure that all Don's idea will get a support, then we need to discuss about the political economy. And let me talk from the perspective that unfortunately in many countries in Southeast Asia, the environmental issue is not something that very close to their heart, because they have to struggle with the day-to-day problem of the issue of poverty, unemployment. So the idea is, if we want to get a political support for this, we have to make sure that all this program will link to the issue of disemployment, of the poverty. So when Don mentioned about this, about this power, for example, if you can make sure that this power will give an access to the poor people, then you will get a support, political support, that this kind of policy is actually pro-poor. If we remove the fuel subsidy, which is unpopular, but if we use this money to finance the fiscal stimulus for help, to help and education, and there is a room that people will support this idea. So I think the biggest problem for many countries, including in Indonesia, is how to link it with the day-to-day problem. But if you talk about something that very abstract, and not many people see this is going to be a big problem immediately, because they have to struggle with the employment issue, for example. But I can see, for example, like the fossil fuel, the resistance will be relatively low because the oil price is relatively low. And we say that we impose a surcharge and use this money to provide an access for the poor people in order to get access to go to school. That's something that politically sound. Let me leave up here.
Thank you so much, Bob. And obviously, when we talk about, we were talking about low carbon energy projects, but infrastructure is more than that. So Will and Warren, would you like to jump in and share your views and maybe respond to what Pak Chatib just said?
Sure, yeah. Let me just add a couple of comments. And I think Pak Chatib makes, gets really to the heart of the issue, that politics and incentives are important. And I'm not really an expert on politics, but I think that in terms of creating the right economic incentives, that's an important part of making some of these ideas work. I think that, as Don mentioned, one of the very attractive things about, one of the good things that's happened out of this crisis, one of the very few good things, is that we have incredibly low interest rates. And so the Fed said, a few days ago that they expect interest rates to remain near zero until 2023. And long-term rates are also very, very low. That gives an opportunity to make investments which are very long-term and visionary in a way we haven't been able to do before, and still generate attractive returns for investors. And so we have seen, a boom in the fixed income market, where things that used to be difficult to finance can be financed now. And also, other good thing is it's happening at the same time that the green bond market and the governance around that has gained traction, liquidity, and importance. So this year in Asia, about 8% of all G3 issuance is green bonds, from almost nothing a few years ago. And so I think that capital market development creates interesting incentives to raise capital from existing infrastructure projects. It could feed into the return calculations around something like the coal retirement fund Don just mentioned, to help facilitate that piece of it. I think that the second part of it is creating the right incentives around the new investments. To me, and there's an obvious, for those who look long-term, there's an obvious incentive that if you believe the world is going to continue to focus on green initiatives, and it's going to become a greater and greater priority over time, if you were building a power plant or something like that today, you would probably want to focus on more sustainable energy. So the value of that power plant would continue in the long run. But I think that's where, you know, multilateral finance, other types of private sector players can also play a role. So for example, the insurance industry has a very strong focus on green finance and can be a very important counterparty for investing in green projects, as can banks, along with multilaterals and doing blended finance to promote these projects in ASEAN.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if Warren is still around, but I'm going to move on very quickly to the questions. There's been some questions that have come in so far, so I'm going to start addressing some of them. And I think the first one maybe I'd like to start with would be, and I think Warren is just joining us right now. But if I could just take questions from here. We've been, Warren, we've just been talking about, you know, what are some of the, how can we create incentives for some of these projects that we're talking about, where it could eventually lead to a much more low carbon economies? And both Will and Pak Khatib have shared their views. So one question I'd like to address would be, how can ASEAN policymakers be encouraged to work on a carbon tax when research has shown that it has adverse impact on critical sectors, such as the manufacturing and agricultural sectors? Anyone, please feel free to address it.
I mean, I guess if we just look at what's happened in the EU again, right? I mean, if we look at how the sort of carbon tax, well, the emission trading scheme that they had in place there have had in place there for quite a while now, it was not the most effective for quite some time, but clearly what we have been seeing, I would say, over the last 2 to 3 years, as we've seen excess allowances taken off the market, that emission trading scheme has become very effective. And it has led to quite a big shift, I would say, in the energy mix in the EU. So again, we've seen a big shift from coal towards natural gas in the EU. If we look at the UK as well, for example, they've got an additional carbon tax. And again, basically, if you look at the UK, the amount of coal in the energy mix has fallen into single digits over the last 5 years or so. So I think it's definitely a route that, you know, ASEAN should look at taking in the near future.
Could I, maybe I could add something? Is that okay, Chen Chen?
Please.
Question. So first of all, I think going back to very good comments from Pak Khatib and Will about the political economy, I think there's a lot of good work that's been done on energy costing that's out there that suggests that actually in a lot of economies, by taking advantage of this very, very low cost funding that now exists in the world today, and using it in combination of retirement of fossil fuels plus investing in more renewables, the total cost of energy can actually be reduced. And that would be meaning lower cost pricing, for example, the masses of people with their energy bills. So there could be a political economy advantage, but that needs to be tested, it needs to be proven, and that message hasn't gotten out. I don't think, especially where fossil fuels are being subsidized, it's artificially creating an impression with people, this is really cheap. Well, it's not cheap when you add in the kind of money that Pak Khatib said that, you know, a country can spend on this as a percentage of its GDP. Actually, you put those costs back. If people had to bear that cost directly, they'd feel very differently about the cost of that fossil fuel energy. Let me just talk about your direct question of the carbon tax. I think that's probably one of the most politically difficult things for a country to impose. Europe was able to set up a system that applies in a certain way, but I think that's hard for a lot of economies to go directly to that. But what's happening indirectly, if we watch efforts that are underway in different even in China today, there are pilots going on for cap and trade. The European cap and trade system it's the biggest one that's in operation today. And Europe has already made, you know, part of its Green New Deal, it's basically laid out a roadmap that suggests it's going to introduce at some point border adjustments, which is a kind of carbon tax. If they're imposing that domestically within Europe, when products are exported from another country, imported into Europe, they will attract a charge, a border adjustment, which is effectively an import tax, to make sure that the cost of carbon is equal between, so that European industry isn't losing out to another country that's not treating its emissions the same way. So that means an ASEAN or any country that's exporting shoes or textiles or whatever it is to Europe, all right, cars. What's the energy content, what's the carbon content of that product is going to be reflected in the price, right? So there's going to be, I think soon as people start to think through, they're going to realize that to be able to remain export competitive, this question of decarbonizing the energy grid isn't just a problem for the energy industry, it's a problem for all industry. They're the consumers of energy. And if you happen to be a shoemaker or a car part producer, and you're using high carbon energy, when your product enters Europe, it's going to attract a very high border adjustment potentially. And that could make your product less competitive than the guy next door who may have decarbonized the energy grid. So I think this becomes an issue for all industry potentially, and may create this more of the political support that Pak Khatib and Will talked about.
Thank you very much, Don. And the next question would be, could one important answer to the global crisis could be to ensure greener public investment by enforcing stronger procurement and PPP rules in the ASEAN? Anyone, please feel free to answer, any of the speakers.
Well, let me try to answer this question. My response is yes. I used to be a chairman of the Indonesia Infrastructure Finance. Yeah, it's a financing company on infrastructure, whereas our shareholders is Asian Development Bank, IFC, and one of the requirement for our investment, they should comply to the standard SNE. So you can imagine in a country like Indonesia, we have to sort of like to apply the standard social and environmental protection, rules. Initially, it was very difficult, but I can see that we are making a progress now. Yeah, because like it or not, if some companies, they would like to borrow money from us, they need to comply on the standard environmental issue. Maybe in the beginning was very difficult, but once you set the standard, I think somehow this will raise the bar for many companies, in my experience in the case of Indonesia, to start to think seriously about this green investment. So that kind of model, I think that will be very useful. And especially nowadays, if you look at the source of funds, especially from Europe, they always require for the environmental concern now. Yeah, so once the source of fund will also require the environmental issue, I think like it or not, investment will go into that direction as well. But I don't expect that this will happen immediately, but somehow we need to start, at the earlier stage, like what we did with the Indonesia Infrastructure Finance.
Thank you, Pa. And I think multilateralizing the financing of infrastructure projects in the region would be a very good way to go when you bring in the development agencies, and bilateral government funding as well. And that hopefully can raise the standards. And I think the infrastructure Asia office in Singapore is trying to address some of these gaps as well by standardizing what should be part of a procurement agreement. But would any of the speakers like to, respond to this question as well? Will?
Sure, yeah. No, I think, thank you, Chen. I think PPP is a very important approach to financing infrastructure, new infrastructure projects, and a way to get a lot of earlier stage projects financed if the rules of the PPP are well designed, both from a financial standpoint, which currently they aren't always in every country, and by creating some guidelines around the key SDGs that are relevant for that particular industry. So I think it's actually a great question and a very important area. But I would just say that I think it's not only that the SDGs need to be looked at in light of the PPP rules, but actually there's a lot of basic work with PPP rules that need to be worked through in many different countries. Sometimes they work quite well, and other times they've been created and they haven't been used hardly at all in certain industries. And so I think making sure those things are functioning and working well so that you have activity and at the same time it's sustainable is a fantastic opportunity.
Thank you, Will. And while we are talking about sort of climate change and green recovery, I have a question here. For ASEAN countries, forest and land use sectors contributes a significant portion of emissions so far, and particularly in Indonesia, that is definitely very true. So do the speakers think that green bonds can change current economic incentives for companies from the forestry, agriculture, plantation, mining sector that still enjoy weak enforcement, low borrowing rates because there's no strong ESG safeguards in financing? Not quite sure if I agree there's no strong ESG safeguards in financing. I think it depends on the banks. But I think the question is about the significance of the forest land use sectors in this region and the fact that there is still a lot of financing that probably do not meet the type of ESG standards that we're after. Would any speaker like to start first?
I'll take a crack at it. I don't know I can't say I'm an expert at it, but my observation is that as more banks sign up to relevant SDGs and the green bond market grows, that a growing number of our clients, both in these kinds of industries as well as many other industries, are spending a lot more time on thinking about the environmental impact and social impact of their businesses. I don't think we've reached the critical scale yet, where it's, a lot of, companies who don't want to listen and don't want to change are going to feel they have to change. But I think that but most companies, including some companies that are in plantations and other industries, are recognize that this is important, and they are listening, and they are trying to do what they can to change, and they realize that the financial industry is moving step by step towards a more sustainable capital market. But I think it's early days, honestly.
Thank you, Will. And I think I would agree with you on that. And when it comes to traceability in the supply chain, it is not just about the environment too, because there are SDG issues associated in the supply chain, such as child labor, for instance, or decent work, etc. So, so it is a complex issue, and my institute has been working in the forestry plantation sector for quite some time, so we understand the complexity of it. Would any other speaker like to, just touch about green bonds and how we can create economic incentives? And I'm sort of staying on this because green bonds is seen as one of the opportunities in which we can promote green recovery. But Khatib, is this something that you can comment on?
Well, one thing that came up to my mind is to use the fiscal framework. Yeah, for example, you can give a different treatment for the green bond compared to the conventional bond, for example. And this somehow will encourage, companies to go for the green bond. Or you can also impose a sort of like provision. Yeah. So that kind of incentive using the fiscal framework probably might help. But I entirely agree with Will. At this moment, we are still in the early stage for this one.
I mean,
Ron, please.
But as Will has suggested, I mean, I think, the global financial institutions are, I think, all working now hard on integrating ESG criteria into their activities, whether that's investing or lending, et cetera. And I think sustainable land use becomes a portion of that. along with other aspects of green, as you discussed. I mean, green bonds and climate bonds have been probably one of the fastest growing categories of fixed income investment over the last few years. And so obviously there is finance being mobilized. But I think, as everybody said, it's still probably early days. And it's not, I mean, it is part of a solution. But you know, you mentioned that your institution has been looking at the complexity around land use. I mean, that's just one example of, I mean, if you look at the reasons for deforestation, they're not simple. Some is due to poverty. People don't cut down trees for fun. And in certain areas, deforestation is part of, let's just call unmanaged land use, where natural forests are invaded by people because they need to earn a few dollars a day by growing cash crops. And they cut down some forest and they plant crops, not necessarily within the zoning regulations, but then they're there. And then settlements spring up. And so in some countries, it's, you could say, poverty drives deforestation. And as jobs and other alternative economic opportunities emerge, either through land use that can be done sustainably and economically make it viable as an anti-poverty effort, suddenly that unauthorized deforestation can be replaced with something that's more sustainable, whether that's sustainable forestry or some other agricultural product, okay? And you can and if you reuse and repurpose land that's already been deforested as opposed to invading new forests for whatever economic purpose, then that can be sustainable. And those sorts of sustainable activities, if they can be monitored and integrated into a supply chain, as we've seen a lot, and we've got companies in the EU-ABC that could talk at length about what they've done in some projects in this area, then you can actually finance that and it could be certifiable as sustainable. But it requires a combination of activity at the local level, a responsible financier, a responsible organization of some kind, and we'll mention plantations, but you know, other kinds of organizations that are the end users of these products, so that you can certify that it really is sustainable. It's complicated, but it's possible. And I think you see more and more good activity focusing on this, and there's a lot of opportunity.
Thank you, Don. The next question, and because we've been talking about green recovery for quite some time, I'd like to move on to more the social aspects of the SDGs. So this question is actually from our very own Nikki. One of the contributions to economic contraction during the COVID is the reduction in consumer spending, and the consequences for the MSME has been devastating in many ASEAN countries. And we know that the informal sector makes up a huge proportion of this region as well in terms of the economies. So how can a return to higher levels of consumption be done in a way that is green, but as well as, you know, it helps us to achieve the SDG goals? And here maybe I can perhaps also at some point bring in Warren as well to talk about the report that you did. While it's been focused on green, whether you see any alignment with SDGs in the stimulus packages of the Southeast Asian countries that you looked at.
Yeah, sure. I can go through basically what we've seen so far. So to start off with, we don't cover all ASEAN economies. We look at 5 of them. So that's Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Singapore. Now, if we start with Indonesia, unfortunately, we've not seen much in the way of green when it comes to their stimulus packages. If we look at total stimulus, it comes in at around 4.2% of GDP, with the bulk of that package going towards income subsidies, cash outlays, and food programs. Well, we've also obviously seen some funds set aside for the healthcare sector. If we move on to Thailand, again, we've seen various stimulus packages there, adds up to about 14.5% of GDP, which includes cash handouts, funds for healthcare, and support for the tourism sector. And then also they've provided soft loans to businesses in the country. But in terms of green spending, again, Thailand has unfortunately fallen short. We could not actually identify anything green in those stimulus packages that were announced. And again, it's a similar story for the Philippines. There, the majority of the stimulus has been allocated to income subsidies, healthcare, and again, support to SMEs. it's really when you get sort of move towards Malaysia, yes, we have seen a portion of stimulus going towards, I'd say, green projects, but the bulk of it, again, has been going towards support for business and individuals, food security programs, as well as infrastructure development. On the green side, we think we've estimated about 4% of the total package from Malaysia is green, and that's with basically funds going towards LED street lighting and rooftop solar panels. And then again, if we look at Singapore, they've basically had around $100 billion Singapore dollar stimulus package, so 20% of GDP, and again, the bulk of that is directed towards supporting households and businesses, and obviously preserving jobs. On the green side, about 11% of the stimulus has gone towards what we class as green, as I mentioned earlier, and that predominantly includes coastal and flood protection funds, the Green Town program for public housing, and that's really about it. Oh no, they've also setting the goal for phasing out internal combustion engines by 2040 and creating incentives for electric vehicle sales. In terms of whether the response is aligned with SDGs, I'd say, yeah, definitely. You know, with the support we've seen given, it is targeting quite a lot of those social SDGs. So the cash handouts, food programs, soft loans, I'll say those are all basically aligned. The issue, as you pointed out earlier, is the large informal sector within developing economies in Southeast Asia. Now, a large part of this workforce will obviously not be registered or not even have a bank account, so it's very difficult for them to even have access to that. But we have seen some governments who have sort of acknowledged this and are addressing it. So, for example, if we look at Thailand, there the government actually has made cash handouts available to informal workers. Now, how exactly that goes ahead, I'm not entirely sure, but we are seeing them targeting those more sort of in that informal sector within Thailand, at least.
So, Warren, green policies on a scale of 1 to 10, probably for Southeast Asia 1. But when it comes to SDG, can we say it's somewhere along 8 or 7, 8 or 9?
Maybe I'm not as optimistic. Yeah, so on the green side, 1, maybe on the social side, sort of a mid to high, maybe 5 to 6.
Okay, you're very harsh.
I'm a strict marker.
The next question is actually from Tan Sri Munia Majid.
Chen, can I just add one point? I think we just all have to recognize these fiscal policies up to this point. They're really, about stabilizing the economy and trying to provide support to people. So if you want to think about it in terms of ESG, the way I think about it is trying to prevent us from going backward on S. In other words, trying to avoid increases in poverty and kids not being able to go to school and health problems and that sort of thing. And so I think the question when you talk about green, to me, it doesn't bother me that much that so far the fiscal policies haven't been that green. It's what comes next when we may have to make investments to create an economic recovery out of this. Once we get through the crisis period, and the question, then there'll be a lot of mobilization of funds required to do things that are a little bit more thoughtful and longer term. And the question is, can we have an impact in terms of green initiatives in that wave of activity?
And Will, I think you are completely spot on. And I think governments now, as you said, they are responding to immediate needs and in a way drawing on the limited domestic reserves that they have, which would be in the pipeline for medium to long-term social and infrastructure projects. But without this funding for these projects, then we go back to the same, inequality and social issues that existed even pre-COVID. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle unless we can come up with more financing for the Southeast Asian governments to deal with both the immediate and the medium and long-term needs. But moving on to a slightly different topic here, and we spoke about technology. So this question is coming from Tan Sri Munia Majid, whom I'm sure some of you know. And his question is actually specifically for Pak Khatib. how do you get ASEAN as a whole excited about SDG as they are about the fourth industrial revolution? With the 4IR, the defining factor of attraction is value creation. But what exactly is SDG? How do we sell it to ASEAN, public, private sector, governments alike?
Well, let me be pragmatic on this. Yeah, I think somehow we have to think about the common platform, the common ground for the Southeast, among the Southeast Asian countries, in which that every Asian countries would agree on. Yeah. So let me give an example. If we are talking about this, one of the potential candidate for the investment, in which that I do believe that every Asian countries will agree, and this is good for the SDG, and this will be good for environment, is a digital transformation. Because if you start to do the digital transformation, somehow this will probably change the behavior of the people to stay at home, work from home, etc. So that kind of model of investment will be good to reduce the traffic, etc. But at the same time, it's also needed for the poor people, etc. So that kind of model. So we have to. The idea is to create a success story in which the people feel the benefit of it. Once you get the success story, you move to the more complex and difficult reform. But if you start with something very complex and difficult, very abstract, you're talking about the carbon tax, I don't think people, layman will understand about it, will get a political support. But let's say if you start with I call this technology, the digital technology, is accidental transformation, because COVID that we have to transform ourselves, right? But this will help for the gender home technology, that women can work from home because of this, yeah? And then, it's also provide an access for people, probably for the informal sector, like it or not, now they can get access for the peer-to-peer lending. So that kind of model, yeah, you create a sort of like your constituent for this. Then once you get the political support, you move to the more and complex. So that kind of entry point, that kind of model, that's what I have in mind. Then like a building block, at the end, you start to talk about this, about the green investment, about the SDGs model. But let's talk about to create the success story first.
Thank you, Pa. Would any other speaker like to respond to this point?
I maybe just add a couple of points. I think this is a great question from Tan Sri. Thank you for raising it. And another example, and it's exactly following what Pak Khatib said about digital transformation. My colleagues on the insurance side in Prudential have been working across the region long hours and have introduced a digital tool called Pulse, which is now downloadable for free in most markets and gives sort of access to wellness and health information. And I think if you look across, Will can talk at length about this, about fintech and health tech innovations that are coming out of China. I mean, there's so much opportunity for bringing, very, very useful information and making it easier. For example, if you use a telemedicine app today, you don't need to travel from a very far distance to get good advice from a specialist doctor. So the advantages of SDG thinking along the digital lines, I think, really will make a huge difference to millions of people. And as Pak Khatib said, will change the minds of how people will think. It's no longer an abstract concept. It's something that actually affects my life and makes it better.
Thank you very much, Don. We are moving close to the end of the session, but I'll take two more questions here. One is a question that I would like to ask all the speakers myself, which is about the aligning of ASEAN's green recovery with the initiatives of some of its major trading partners, such as the EU and its Green Deal, or to some extent the UK as well, where they have moved very much on trying to build back better in the post-pandemic world. So how do you see this partnership between ASEAN and the EU, or maybe even the UK, happening when it comes to tackling some of these big, hairy green issues in ASEAN? Don, maybe you'd like to start?
It's probably going to default to me since I'm the guy with the EU-ASEAN in the background here, unless Chris Humphrey wants to break his neutrality on this question. But I mean, there are a range of cooperative measures that the EU is doing together with ASEAN in terms of looking at sustainable, increasing sustainability across the region. And so, that's in terms of grants and so forth. The EU has played and countries in Europe have played a big role in supporting the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, for example, which is run by the ADB. And I think Europe's probably the largest contributor to that facility. There's quite a number of other initiatives working on the integration of ASEAN economically. Which, as I go back to what I said earlier, if ASEAN can make more progress on some of the barriers within ASEAN and attract more investment domestically and internationally, that recovery will be stronger, and some of this potential for backsliding and losing ground on the SDGs will be, we won't have that risk anymore. So I think Europe is stepping up, and European companies, British companies are playing a role in that. I mean, we've got companies like our own that have been in the region for 100 years and think in a very long-term way. So that's not surprising.
Thank you very much, Dawn. And the last question, very nicely, is addressed to Pak Khatib, Warren, and Will. We spoke about it, in the last 1 hour or so. But again, I would just like you to, in your opinion, what is the most practical or best financing option that emerging economies such as some Southeast Asian countries with limited fiscal room, what can we explore to finance green projects in the medium term of 3 to 5 years? Maybe I'll start with Pak Khatib first.
Again, to me, that one of the potential policy that could be done relatively easy at this moment is removing the fuel subsidy when the oil price is relatively low, and putting this money for the financing the fiscal stimulus for health and also for the poor people.
Will and Warren?
So yeah, no, as I spoke earlier, I think the big opportunity is around leveraging a lot of the existing stabilized projects and using those as the basis for new capital markets financings, taking advantage of the fact that there's such low rates and investors are demanding such low returns for such assets right now, and there's a very high demand.
And Warren, please.
Yeah, I would have to just agree with Pak Khatib about lowering subsidies and using those to fund other projects.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I think we've reached the end of this webinar. Thank you very much to all the speakers for being so patient with all the questions and staying with us. And thank you to you, audience, for also staying on, listening to this fantastic webinar on some really critical issues facing the region, and for sharing your questions with us. I'm supposed to summarize what we've discussed, but we've discussed quite a whole range of issues. I'm not quite sure how to summarize, but I think what we can agree on is that ASEAN governments have taken the right step in addressing some of the immediate health, economic recovery priorities. And I think there is a consensus that the governments need to do more in terms of attaining the SDGs and in terms of moving towards a low carbon economies in the future to future-proof, our planet, the region's long-term prosperity, given that the region is so susceptible to climate change impacts as well. But how do we get new financing for that? I think we've heard from the panelists a few pragmatic options, and Pak Khatib has suggested the removal of fuel subsidies, which is very much supported by industry experts such as Warren and Will, and also looking at existing projects to see how we could, as Will said, recycle some of the capital investment and leverage them to come up with new financing. So I think I'll end here and thank all of you for staying with us and pass the floor over to Chris.
Thank you, Chen Chen. Thank you, Will, Don, Warren, and Pak Khatib as well. Very, very thrilling conversation. I think you could have gone on for another half an hour or so without too much trouble. Good participation from the audience. Thank you, everybody, for staying on for so long with us. when it's late in the evening here in Southeast Asia. Please look out for future webinars we've got coming up around investments and COVID-19 and on the future of the digital economy in Southeast Asia as well, and some other sessions we have coming up with ministers across the region. So again, thank you, Chen Chen. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to our audience, and please all keep safe. Good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.